I thought the most unforgettable moment of my life would be the second I said, "I do." But I was wrong, because the moment everyone would remember forever was the second the church doors opened and the most feared man in the city walked in like the wedding belonged to him. My name is Emily Carter, and until 10 minutes ago my biggest worry was whether the florist had arranged the white roses correctly along the aisle. The church smelled like fresh lilies and candle wax, soft piano music echoing under the tall stained glass windows, while sunlight spilled across the marble floor. My father stood beside me, proud and nervous, and at the end of the aisle Daniel was waiting in a perfectly tailored navy suit, smiling like the future was already written for us. Everything was quiet, beautiful, predictable, the kind of wedding people post about online with captions like, "The perfect day." I took a slow breath, my heels clicking gently against the stone floor as I walked forward, each step carrying me toward the life I thought I understood. Guests watched with warm smiles, 100 friendly faces turning toward me, the priest adjusting the small microphone near the altar. I remember thinking how calm everything felt, how peaceful the world seemed inside those old church walls. Then the door slammed open so hard the sound echoed like thunder. Every head turned at the same time. The music stopped. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. A tall man stepped inside wearing a black suit so sharply tailored it looked like armor. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He just walked forward slowly, confidently, as if he had every right to interrupt a wedding attended by half the city. No one tried to stop him. Not the ushers. Not the security standing near the entrance. I could hear quiet whispers ripple through the room like wind across water. People recognized him. I could see it in their faces. Fear, respect, curiosity. But I didn't recognize him at all. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his expression calm, almost unreadable, and when his eyes finally met mine something strange happened inside my chest, like a memory trying to wake up from a deep sleep. He walked straight down the aisle toward me, the sound of his shoes against the marble echoing through the silent church. My father stiffened beside me, confused, protective, but the man never looked at him. He only looked at me. When he stopped a few feet away, the entire room felt frozen in place. The man studied my face like he had been searching for it for a long time. Then he spoke in a steady voice that carried easily through the quiet church. "Stop the wedding," he said. The priest blinked in shock. Daniel stepped forward in disbelief. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then the stranger said the sentence that shattered the entire room. "She's carrying my child." For a moment nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My mind struggled to understand what I had just heard. I had never seen this man before in my life. At least, that's what I believed until he looked directly into my eyes and said one more quiet sentence that made my stomach drop. "You just don't remember meeting me." I could hear the whisper before I could hear my own thoughts. It moved through the church like a quiet storm. People leaned toward each other, voices low but urgent, as if the name of the man standing in front of me carried weight, even when it was spoken carefully. I looked at him again, trying to understand why everyone else seemed to know exactly who he was while I stood there in a white dress feeling like the only person in the room who had missed an important piece of the story. My father shifted beside me, his hand tightening slightly around mine, protective and uncertain at the same time. Daniel stepped forward from the altar, confusion written all over his face. He looked from me to the stranger in the black suit and back again, searching for some explanation that made sense. The stranger did not look at him. He did not look at anyone else in the church. His attention stayed on me, steady and calm, as if the entire room had faded into the background. There was something unsettling about that calm. Not threatening, just absolute, like a man who had already decided how the story was going to end. I swallowed slowly, trying to steady my voice. I told him that he was mistaken. I told him that I had never seen him before. The words sounded small even to my own ears. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply studied my face for another long moment, then gave the slightest shake of his head. "You met me once," he said quietly. "You just do not remember." The sentence made a strange chill run down my spine. I searched my memory quickly, flipping through years of ordinary days, college classes, family dinners, quiet weekends, but nothing in my life connected to this man. He looked like someone who belonged to a completely different world. A world of dark suits, expensive watches, and rooms where people lowered their voices when he walked in. I could see that in the way the guests watched him. No one interrupted. No one ordered him to leave. Even the priest remained silent, standing beside the altar with his hands folded, as if he had suddenly forgotten what ceremony he was supposed to finish. Daniel tried again, his voice careful but firm, asking the stranger what he meant. This time the man finally looked away from me for a second. His eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the stunned faces, the flowers, the quiet tension hanging in the air. When his gaze returned to me, something in it had softened just slightly, almost like recognition mixed with patience. "A few months ago," he said, "you were at St. Augustine Hospital just after midnight." The words landed like a stone in still water. My mind paused, because that part was true. I had been there. I volunteered there sometimes after my evening shifts at the community center. It was quiet work, helping nurses move supplies, sitting with patients who did not have family nearby, small things that made long nights easier for strangers. I felt my heart begin to beat faster as pieces of that night tried to come back to me. I remembered rain against the windows. I remembered a rushed ambulance arrival. I remembered nurses moving quickly down the hallway. But before the memory could fully form, the man in front of me spoke again in the same calm voice. "That was the night you saved my life, Emily." I stared at him, certain that I had heard him wrong. The words did not fit the moment, the place, or the man standing in front of me. Saved his life. The sentence echoed in my mind while the church remained frozen. Around us, I tried to remember that night clearly, but my memories were scattered pieces instead of a full picture. I remembered the rain tapping against the hospital windows. I remembered the quiet halls after midnight when most of the city was asleep. I remembered the smell of coffee and disinfectant drifting through the nurse's station while I helped restock supply carts. But I did not remember him. Not the tall man with the calm eyes and the perfectly tailored black suit who had just stopped my wedding. My voice came out softer than I expected when I asked what he was talking about. He answered without hesitation. He said that an ambulance had arrived shortly after midnight, carrying a man who had been injured in a car accident outside the city. He said the emergency room had been crowded that night, and the nurses needed help quickly. I felt a small shock run through me, because that part was true. I had been asked to help that night. I had helped push a supply cart into the emergency wing because several patients had arrived at the same time. I remembered the bright overhead lights and the hurried footsteps of doctors moving past me. I remembered someone asking if any volunteers could help donate blood because the hospital blood bank was running low. At the time, it had not felt like a dramatic moment. It had felt like something simple, something ordinary, a small decision made during a long night. I looked back at the man standing in front of me and tried to understand how that quiet memory could possibly connect to him. The guests in the church were still watching us, whispering quietly, but their voices sounded distant now. The world had narrowed to the few feet between us. The man nodded slowly as if he could see the memory beginning to form in my mind. "You agreed to donate blood," he said calmly. "You did not ask who it was for. You did not ask anything at all. The hospital staff said they needed help, and you said yes." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the small bouquet in my hands. That part was also true. I had donated blood before. It had never seemed like a big decision. The nurses had thanked me, given me a cup of juice, and told me to rest for a few minutes before I went home. It had been just another quiet act of kindness during a long volunteer shift. But the man in front of me looked at me like that moment had changed something important in his life. He took a slow breath before speaking again, his voice still calm, but carrying a weight that made the room feel even quieter. "That blood saved my life that night, Emily. The doctors told me later that if it had not arrived when it did, things might have ended very differently." My heart began to race again as the pieces tried to fit together. I shook my head slowly because something about the story still felt incomplete. I told him that even if that were true, it did not explain why he had just walked into a church and made a claim like that in front of everyone I knew. For the first time since he had arrived, the faintest hint of emotion crossed his expression. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to quiet certainty. "Because," he said slowly, "the blood test results from that night revealed something neither of us knew at the time." The words hung in the air like a question the entire church was afraid to ask. I felt my pulse beating in my ears while I stared at him, trying to understand how a simple blood donation could possibly lead to the sentence he had spoken a few minutes ago. The man watched me quietly, giving me time as if he already knew my mind was racing through every memory I had of that night. The rain outside the hospital, the bright hallway lights, the tired nurse who had thanked me after the donation was finished. None of it felt extraordinary at the time. It had felt like one small moment inside an ordinary life. But the way he looked at me now made it feel like that moment had been the beginning of something neither of us had understood. I asked him what the blood test results had to do with anything happening here today. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He answered slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said that when the doctors ran the tests on the blood that night, they noticed something unusual in the results. Something rare. Something that required a second review by the hospital laboratory. I frowned slightly because I had never received a call about any unusual test result. The hospital had simply thanked me for the donation and told me I could leave after resting for a few minutes. He nodded as if he had expected that reaction. Of course you did not hear about it, he said. The hospital contacted me, not you. I felt a ripple of confusion move through me again. Why would a hospital contact a patient about a blood donor's test results? That did not make sense. The man took one slow breath before continuing. He explained that the doctors had discovered that my blood carried a very rare genetic marker, something that only a small percentage of people in the world shared. According to the hospital laboratory, that marker also appeared in his own medical records. I blinked in disbelief because the explanation sounded like something from a medical documentary, not something that belonged in the middle of my wedding day. Around us, the church remained silent. Into that emergency room. I felt the ground beneath my feet shift, even though I had not moved an inch. Connected. The word echoed in my mind, while the quiet church seemed to hold its breath around us. I searched his face for any sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding, but his expression remained calm and certain, like a man who had spent months confirming every detail before stepping through those doors. My father finally spoke beside me, his voice firm but controlled as he asked the man exactly what he meant by connected. The stranger glanced at him politely before looking back at me, as if the answer belonged to me more than anyone else in the room. According to the hospital laboratory, he said slowly, the genetic marker in your blood appears in only a handful of family lines across the country. My doctors recognized it immediately because it also exists in my family records. I felt my mind struggling to keep up with the information. My family was ordinary. My father ran a small construction business. My mother taught third grade for 20 years before retiring. Nothing about our lives suggested secret family connections to powerful strangers in expensive suits. I shook my head gently, trying to push away the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. That still does not explain what you said earlier, I told him quietly. The man nodded once as if he had expected that question from the beginning. You are right, he replied. The connection alone does not explain it. The real answer came from something else the doctors noticed when they completed the rest of the medical tests that night. His voice lowered slightly, not in secrecy, but in seriousness. When your blood was processed, the hospital ran a standard panel of routine health checks. One of those tests included hormone levels that doctors usually confirm for female donors as part of their records. I felt a sudden knot tighten in my stomach before he even finished the sentence. The man watched my reaction carefully before continuing. The results suggested that you were already in the very early stages of pregnancy that night. The church erupted with quiet gasps. I heard someone drop a program in the back row. My heart began pounding so loudly that the rest of the room blurred for a moment. That is impossible, I said quickly, the words escaping before I could slow them down. I would have known. I would have noticed something. The man did not argue. He simply spoke again in the same calm tone. At that point, neither you nor the hospital staff connected the information to me, he said. The doctors simply recorded the data and moved on because your identity as a donor was confidential. But months later, when my medical team reviewed every detail from the night I arrived at that emergency room, they noticed the timeline. They noticed the rare genetic marker. And they noticed something else that should not have existed at the same time. I felt my fingers tighten around the bouquet again as the weight of his words slowly settled into place. What's something else? I asked quietly. The man held my gaze without hesitation before answering. According to those records, Emily, the genetic pattern in your blood and the early pregnancy markers matched mine in a way that the doctors could not ignore. I could feel every eye in the church on me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to say something that would turn this strange moment back into a normal wedding. But nothing about the man standing in front of me felt normal anymore. His words moved slowly through my mind, heavy and impossible. Genetic patterns, medical timelines, pregnancy markers. It all sounded like pieces of a puzzle that did not belong to my life. I shook my head again, more firmly this time, trying to hold on to the reality I knew. I told him the doctors had to be wrong. There was no other explanation. I had lived every day of my life with careful routines and ordinary plans. I worked at the community center. I volunteered at the hospital. I spent weekends helping my parents around the house. Nothing in that quiet life connected to the kind of story he was describing. The man listened patiently, not interrupting, not raising his voice. When I finished speaking, he nodded slightly as if he understood exactly why I refused to believe him. Then he spoke again in that same steady tone that seemed to calm the entire room, even while his words created more questions. The doctors did not make a mistake, Emily, he said. I had the results reviewed by 3 separate medical teams. Every one of them reached the same conclusion. My heart tightened at the certainty in his voice. I glanced toward Daniel, who stood several feet away near the altar. His face had gone pale, his hands hanging stiffly at his sides as he tried to process everything happening around him. I hated the confusion in his eyes, hated the way this moment was tearing through what had been a perfect day only minutes ago. I turned back to the stranger, forcing myself to ask the question that had been building in my chest since he first spoke. If the doctors believe what you are saying, I asked quietly, then explain something to me. Explain how that could possibly happen when we have never even met. The church became even quieter, if that was possible. The man studied my face for a long moment before answering. For the first time, there was a trace of something deeper in his expression. Not arrogance, not triumph, something closer to concern. Because the night you were at the hospital, he said slowly, the doctors were not only treating my injuries. They were performing an experimental procedure that very few medical centers in the country were equipped to handle. The sentence made my stomach drop slightly. Experimental procedure. That phrase carried a weight that none of his previous explanations had held. I asked him what kind of procedure he was talking about. He did not hesitate. My family has funded a medical research program for several years, he explained. The hospital you volunteered at is one of the facilities involved. That night, the doctors used my case to test a new emergency preservation technique designed to protect genetic material during life-threatening trauma. I stared at him in disbelief, trying to follow the meaning behind his calm explanation. The man continued carefully, choosing each word with precision. Your donated blood was introduced into that process in a way the doctors had never attempted before. At the time, no one realized the combination of your rare genetic marker and the experimental procedure could create an unexpected result. My breath caught in my throat as the pieces began to move into a shape I did not want to understand. When the research team reviewed the data months later, he said quietly, they discovered that the process had triggered something they had never seen before in human medicine. I felt the air leave my lungs as his last sentence settled over the room. Something they had never seen before in human medicine. The words sounded too large, too unbelievable to belong in the middle of my wedding day. For a moment, I could not even hear the whispers from the guests anymore. All I could hear was the quiet echo of his voice repeating in my mind. I tried to steady my breathing while searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. But the man standing in front of me did not look uncertain. He looked like someone who had spent months carrying a truth that no one else wanted to believe. I asked him what exactly the doctors had discovered. My voice felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The man paused for a moment before answering, as if choosing words that would not frighten me more than necessary. The experimental procedure was designed to protect genetic material during extreme trauma, he explained. Normally, it would only stabilize the patient long enough for surgery. But when your blood entered the process, the rare genetic marker reacted with the preservation system in a way the researchers had never predicted. My mind struggled to follow the explanation, but I forced myself to listen because something inside me knew the next sentence would change everything again. The research team reviewed the data for months after I recovered, he continued. At first, they believed the system had simply created an unusual laboratory reaction. But then they noticed something in the follow-up reports from the hospital. I felt my stomach tighten as I asked what kind of report he meant. The man met my eyes calmly. A routine health update connected to your donor profile, he said. The hospital requires follow-up records for volunteers who donate blood in certain research environments. One of those reports confirmed something that the doctors could not ignore. The church felt impossibly quiet as I waited for him to finish. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away. When the laboratory compared the preservation data from that night with your medical update weeks later, he said slowly, they discovered that the genetic material stabilized during that procedure had continued to develop. I stared at him in disbelief, my fingers trembling slightly around the bouquet. That is not possible, I whispered. The man did not react to the words. He simply continued speaking with the same calm certainty. The doctors believed the same thing at first, he said, but the data repeated itself in every test they performed afterward. According to the research team, the preservation system accidentally created a viable genetic pairing between my DNA and yours during the emergency process. My heart pounded harder with every word. Around us, the church remained silent, every guest leaning forward in stunned disbelief. I shook my head again, but the denial sounded weaker this time. Even if that were somehow true, I said quietly, it still does not explain why you would walk into a church and say something like that in front of everyone. The man took one slow step closer, his voice lowering just slightly as he answered. Because the doctors confirmed something else 2 weeks ago, Emily. According to the latest medical report, the genetic pairing created that night did not remain in the laboratory data. It continued developing inside you. I felt the entire world tilt beneath my feet as his last sentence echoed through the silent church. Continued developing inside you. The words sounded unreal, like something from a science documentary instead of my own life. For several seconds I could not move, could not breathe, could not even hear the quiet whispers spreading through the guests behind me. I stared at him, trying to force logic back into the moment. I told him that what he was describing was impossible. Science did not work like that. Life did not work like that. The man listened calmly, his expression steady, almost patient, as if he had already lived through this exact reaction many times in his own mind before coming here. I asked him how he could possibly know something like that about my body. My voice sounded sharper now, not from anger, but from fear. For the first time since he had walked into the church, the man reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Several guests shifted nervously in their seats, but his movement remained slow and careful. He pulled out a thin folder and held it gently in one hand. Medical reports, he said quietly. 2 weeks ago, the research team requested a follow-up review of the donor records connected to the procedure. They contacted the hospital. Laboratory again. I felt my stomach tighten as he continued speaking. The hospital had updated files connected to my volunteer profile, including routine health information I had provided during my last community medical screening. According to him, the research team compared that data with the preservation records from the night of the accident. The results confirmed something they could no longer ignore. I shook my head again, my fingers trembling around the flowers I still held. You cannot possibly know that, I said. I have not taken any test like that recently. The man nodded slowly as if he had expected that response as well. You did not request the test, he replied calmly. It was part of a routine health screening performed at the community center 3 weeks ago. The medical staff submitted the results to the hospital database automatically. My heart skipped a beat because I remembered that screening. A simple volunteer wellness check organized for staff and volunteers. Blood pressure. Basic blood work. Nothing unusual. I had forgotten about it the moment I walked out the door. But the man in front of me had not forgotten. His voice remained quiet as he spoke again. The laboratory compared those results with the preservation data from that night and found something developing exactly according to the genetic pairing created during the procedure. Around us, the church felt frozen in place. I could see my father staring at the folder in the man's hand. I could see Daniel standing near the altar, pale and silent, trying to understand how our wedding day had turned into a medical mystery. My heart pounded harder as the stranger took one small step closer, lowering his voice so that the next words felt almost personal despite the crowded room around us. The doctors wanted confirmation before contacting you, he said. That confirmation arrived 2 days ago. According to every test they repeated, the same conclusion remained. The unexpected genetic pairing from that night is not theoretical anymore. It is real. I felt my breath catch as he looked directly into my eyes and finished the sentence that made the entire church feel smaller. Emily, The doctors believe you are carrying a child created during that emergency procedure, and the DNA results show that I am the only possible father." I could feel the silence pressing against my ears after he finished speaking. The church that had been filled with music and laughter less than an hour ago now felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. My heart was beating so loudly that for a moment I thought everyone else could hear it. The man stood in front of me holding the thin folder of medical reports as calmly as if he had simply walked into a quiet meeting instead of interrupting a wedding. I stared at him, trying to force my mind to reject everything he had just said. A child created during an emergency medical procedure. A genetic pairing that should not exist. It sounded impossible, but the certainty in his voice made the word impossible feel weaker every second. I finally found my voice and asked him the only question that mattered now. "Why would you come here and say this today in front of everyone?" The man did not look away from me when he answered. "Because the doctors asked me to bring you to them as soon as possible," he said calmly. "They believe the situation is medically unique and they need to monitor it carefully. But that is not the only reason." I felt my fingers tighten around the bouquet as he continued. "The research program that funded that procedure involves powerful interests and strict confidentiality. Once the results became clear, several people wanted the situation handled quietly without ever informing you." His words made a cold feeling move through my chest. "What do you mean handled quietly?" I asked. The man's expression hardened slightly for the first time since he had arrived. "It means some people believe the research mattered more than the truth," he said. "They believed it would be easier if you never knew what happened that night." A soft wave of shocked murmurs spread through the guests again. My father stepped closer beside me, his protective presence steady even as the entire room listened. I asked the stranger why he would care about any of this if what he said was true. He could have stayed silent. He could have allowed those powerful people to keep their secret. The man looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke again his voice carried something different from before, something quieter. "Because whether this situation was created by science or by accident," he said slowly, "it still involves a life that now belongs to both of us." I felt my breath catch as the weight of his words settled around me. The church no longer felt like a place for vows and celebrations. It felt like the edge of a decision I had never imagined facing. I glanced back toward the altar where Daniel still stood in stunned silence, then toward my father whose hand rested gently on my shoulder. My entire life had been built on simple choices and ordinary days. Now a stranger had walked into the room and placed an impossible future in front of me. The man waited patiently, giving me space to think even while the entire church watched. After a long moment, he spoke one final sentence that seemed to echo through the quiet building. "The doctors are waiting for us right now. Emily," he said. "The only question left is whether you are ready to hear what they discovered next."